So first of all, thank you everyone for staying with us for what's just been a fantastic day. I've taken some notes, and I'll just highlight a few things that really resonated with me, and then hand it off to Peter and Marshall to make some of their comments in terms of what they've heard. But first, I'd just like to thank again um, Carrie, Devin, the entire IDE staff, for again, the quick pivot, just really being able to pull together this event in this unusual kind of venue, but it really allowed us to do some pretty cool things, and especially live music that would have been really difficult to pull off, and yet in it came right from their living room to ours. Um, so a couple of thoughts. Uh, and I think that John Halamka and Scott and Roland Bush and really Connie and Jessica, the whole team has given us a lot to think about. Um, I One point was this notion of the willingness to fail and just how different that is from kind of traditional and incumbent firms. Because if you think about my alma mater was GE Medical, sort of heavy capital equipment in the healthcare space. I think Marshall was in Lockheed Martin, and Peter has a background in sort of classic corporations. A lot of the way that those companies would go to market, and this continues to be true, is a very rigorous stage gate planning process where you identify a market, you think about a product and conceive it, and then you think about every possible iteration and possibility. You sort of grind through a whole ton of pro formas and financials, and you try to justify these cases. um, and then you launch it. You obviously do the plan, do, check, act cycles to do continuous improvement. But how does that compare to John's sort of suggestion that you had to be comfortable with an 80% fail rate? And the answer is those don't square at all. And this notion of sort of failing cheaply, and then Scott talked about failing without code and sort of achieving product market fit and understanding that without really sinking a lot of resources is a story that, of course, resonates in entrepreneurial sort of activity in startups. But I think it's particularly true in these platform markets because they can easily just die, and many of them will. And if they take off, then it's time to make the follow on investments. So I think that's a kind of one thing that just seemed to resonate again and again. And I think another one was, and we saw a number of questions come in, and we always get asked this. You guys have done a lot of research in B2C markets. Where are we in B2B? Sort of, the business to consumer side, those are stories we know. The business to business. And then right after that question, we had Roland Bush. Um, Take us through, in Siemens, a pretty comprehensive look at a company that's been in business for a very long time, that is taking this B2B seriously. And I think dovetailed, if you look at what John was talking about at Mayo, yes, there's a lot of patient experience, but behind the scenes, they're interacting with about 1,000 different organizations, and much of that is going to be B2B and never visible to what's happening on the patient side. We didn't get a full chance to explore all of those implications and facts but I had a good deal of interaction with him beforehand. Um, and then, uh, if maybe I'll just kind of close with emphasizing this notion that Scott talked about, quote, having to ring fence and hide or rigorously defend the new ventures to prevent the natural corporate antibodies. And this is coming from the CEO. So you can imagine the challenge that you face in an organization when you have your kind of nifty platform idea from middle management. It suggests that perhaps one of the first steps to get going is to engage and find enough protection at the, kind of the board and senior management level, and to get that protection lined up for a long term. Because you can just tell that if Scott's having to sort of fend off the antibodies, you can just imagine what that looks like in the organization. One thing we didn't get a chance to explore with them because we didn't have enough time, but sort of what are the implications for training, for education, for kind of socializing some of these initiatives, so that you have a higher chance of success. So those are a few initial observations, and so I'll hand it off to Marshall or Peter, but I'm sure I'll circle back because I think we can turn this into a bit of a round robin conversation.
Yeah. Well, I just make a few comments. One is, I love doing this every year because it just opens your eyes to the so many different ways that platform business models can arise and be applied. We've said in the past, anywhere there can be a platform, there will be a platform. And I think what's interesting is we're moving from easier to consummate matches and pricing systems to increasingly complex ones in which we're getting multi-layered, the idea of the super app, that's actually the joining of multiple platforms into one. And so I think we're going to see more of that. And then, what I tried to do this year with inviting Joe Pine and his panel is to explore areas that we haven't in the past, which is kind of the application of platforms to experiences. And there are actually dozens and dozens and dozens of platforms emerging in that space that are going to allow for mass personalization in an interesting kind of way, right? You can match a lot of people, but you're still delivering a very personalized experience. So I think that's extremely interesting and exciting. And I guess the last thing I would mention is, we focus a lot on becoming a platform, being a platform, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we're now living increasingly in a platform economy. And so it's not just becoming a platform, it's actually knowing how to use platforms. And so that's a skill unto itself. Platforms actually deliver a lot of things. I actually wasn't aware of the TurboTax example of the insights you can gain inside of TurboTax because of the question and answer and the kind of the wiki systems that they've set up. And that's pretty interesting, right? So you actually have to get inside some of these apps. And I think increasingly companies are going to recognize that they can lean into and tap into platforms to deliver things that are valuable for their either product or services that they're seeking to deliver. So becoming a platform is one thing, but also being good at knowing how to use platforms is another really interesting skill set that's going to become more increasingly important.
So Marshall, before you get going, let me just say one thing to our audience. We probably have time for a couple of questions. So if you want to throw those into chat, Marshall, Peter, and I can do this all day, but
which we do sometimes.
We'd like to make it interactive, which we do, but we'd like to make it also interactive. And I see already that there are one or two questions that have popped in, but anything else, just put into the chat and or the Q&A, and then the IDE team will get it over to us. Over to you, Marshall.
So there are several things in here that I thought are actually useful. One of them, right at the beginning, Dr. Bush actually pointing out, in effect, where there's the opportunity to be an operating system for industrial goods. So I actually think in the Internet of Things, there's going to be huge opportunities in industrial space, and we have to stop treating these industrial firms just as machine equipment, but possibly as orchestrators of whole ecosystems. I think there are enormous opportunities there. Really interesting points from Jessica Tan. I loved her story that they had taken, dropped conversions in insurance where the best insurance agents on average, or the average insurance agent achieved about a 20% conversion rate. They trained their AI systems using the best folks and then got a 35% conversion rate. Really quite extraordinary. Again, use of information or creation. This is often an example that we use of creating network effects, using information to spread it across different folks and actually create value. I thought it was a fantastic story. A similar set of interesting insights came out of Haromka's discussion. So I love the idea that they were actually a cloud-based system back in the 1880s using pneumatic tubes in order to get information from person to person. So they were sharing information across doctors. Again, in some ways, this information is essential to creating these valuable businesses. Sharing information was a message that came out of that. And also this idea of an information navigator, where his mother didn't necessarily want to deal with the APIs or downloading the data. But if there's someone who's expert and can actually take the role of husbanding that information for the benefit of the users, that's a valuable role. That's in some sense where you internalize the externalities and actually play a governance role and create real value. Connie had a couple of really important points. One of them is the high frequency creates engagement, creates opportunity for the super app. Again, it may be the case that a low margin business may be a fantastic place to actually build a platform because of the high frequency engagement, as in the case of Meituan, that then added hotel and travel booking, which are very high margin, but low frequency engagement. And they took over from the apps that were already doing that, but that had low frequency engagement. So the folks were already in place and actually got that to add value. So it's adding in, and also adding information to a traditional good, almost tying back to Dr. Bush, which is adding information to mining in order to convert that into a platform business. I thought was quite interesting. And then Scott, picking up on some of the things that Jeff highlighted, Scott had some interesting insights, again, on quick and rapid pivot and experimentation. He started his company addressing a pain point. He said often with really low code or really simple experiments, you may be able to identify a pain point and use and launch there quickly without having to launch an enormous number of resources. Again, in a sense, Quibi did the opposite. They should have tested if folks really wanted to do it, and they dropped lots of money and seems not to have worked quite so much. And again, in some sense, from the research that we produce, I also just wanted to reiterate, there's a big difference in the different kinds of investments that you can make. So if it's the marketing investments to attract users, it's very different than the architectural investments to create network effects and to keep the relationships on platform. Again, this helps to explain the difference between value between Meituan and Groupon. So I think there's some really important lessons here in the element of platform design. So I think there's an enormous number of things to take away from today's today's workshop, and I look forward to writing this up and making sure that it's available, I guess, in next year's booklet as well.
So there are actually a couple of questions that have just come in. And so before we sort of do our final wrap, in particular, a question came in asking about what innovation in platforms are you guys most excited about in the next 5-10 years? And what do those look like? So I think that the technology is always going to be changing. So, I mean, we wouldn't have the platforms we have today without the revolution in information communications, storage, compute, kind of across the board. But I think the next round of innovations, I mean, or at least a category of next round of innovations, is going to be around the way people think about their data and their willingness to share. And where will we see intermediaries sort of act on data owners' behalves? Because if we start to give sort of rights in data, that could potentially create so much friction that many of the benefits that we've seen from platforms disappear. So how do we sort of maintain the value add while still ensuring kind of fair divisions of labor? And I think that's a big innovation kind of in the economics and policy space that might address some of the concerns that we've seen over the rise in the power of sort of these enormous firms. So that's kind of one thought. So hand it over.
So I wanted to add two thoughts to that. One, actually, I think it's underappreciated the extent to which the technology that was brought up in Connie's talk on app clips is really interesting. Small mom and pop shops don't want to have to invest in cloud services on their own. It doesn't make any sense. It makes far more sense for them to use Amazon Web Services or Azure or Google Cloud. Vastly better idea. Same thing's true in apps. Every tiny little store doesn't have to have an app developer because you got to get 1,000 people to try to download the app. It's not going to happen. These app clips make it geolocation aware, so you may be able to take advantage of another super app, and you can just plug in with a QR code or just with proximity. I think that's going to blow open some of the platform opportunity just in a technology sense. So I think that's something that's going to be most excited. So that's the first element. The second element, picking up on what Jeff said, I actually think there are huge issues in the ownership of this information, in the creation of wealth with this information, and then also in the social effects on the communications channels with misinformation. And I actually think it is incumbent upon us as a society and on platforms as well to start cleaning up some of the misinformation that is being moved around on platforms. So I think we need to look at some of the downsides and look at this as a kind of a pollution problem that will also be dealt with. So I think there are huge upsides and opportunities, and again, wonderful investments to be made. And I also think there are social costs that we should be considering. And I actually think we will be, I can say, we're going to be trying to conduct some of the research on how to solve some of those problems. I think we will be better off as a society if we capture the upside and mitigate the downside, because both are present.
Right. So it's a little bit smaller space, but a space that I'm very interested in right now is how do you improve the user experience, not just in the seamlessness of the digital interaction and the connectivity, but how does it sound to people? And so it's interesting that Amazon recently integrated a sound library into Alexa. It actually turns out that your performance and how you do control with the voice technology actually works better if you integrate it with sound. So that, for example, Philips Lighting now, when you have the Alexa skill to turn on the lights, it affirms it not with a voice command, but actually with a sound, like ding ding. So as Roland Bush was speaking about the Internet of Things and all the different ways you can bring platform strategies into the B2D space. And we also know that we're going to see more automation and more robots and things of that nature. How does that interact with humans, and often integrating not just voice control, but sound, so that those cobots and those voice controls become integrated with the way that people behave. And so what's interesting is a lot of people focus on the technology and the business model, but not the full user experience. And so there's lots of innovations that could happen to bring a better full embellishment of the user experience. And just like this event today, this conference would have been less if we hadn't had music as part of the experience. And so there's lots of conferences and events going on. There could be a matching platform to match artists with, events that are taking place online and things of that nature. So just a little piece, but I think that enriches what we're doing here from kind of human experience standpoint as well.
Well, I see another question here. It's come in from the audience. What are our thoughts on platforms and national security, open source, and intelligence aspects? I've got a couple of thoughts. I don't know if Peter or Jeff want to jump in on that. I actually think there are some big issues on that question.
Well, no, take it away. I mean, we had a really good panel at last year's conference on exactly those issues. So I think that's one of those sort of ever fresh topics that is never going to go away.
Yeah, I would say there's two sides to it. One are the reality that platforms are now driving innovation, and so they've become so important that they are actually influencing national systems of innovation. So there's the value capture on that side, but there's also the concern of encroachment in wealth generation. They often say data is the new oil, but platforms may be the new seven sisters, so to speak, in the sense that wherever there is value capture or value creation, there's interested in who's capturing that, and states get involved in that process. So this is not going to go away. As platforms become engines of value creation, you're going to see states want to intervene to influence where that value is captured. So that's happening on the tax side, as well as data residency rule, and even some point out that these privacy rules aren't so much driven by concerns about citizens' rights over privacy, but actually backdoor protectionism. So, this issue isn't going away and may actually intensify in the years to come.
I think it's a deeply interesting question that is going to be with us for a long time. And I think we should be asking the question from at least two different levels. One of these is to look at the difference between individual civil liberties and the power that the platforms have. That's within a state. How do you balance the civil liberties of the folks whose data are being gathered? And what are the negative consequences that others with monopoly power may impose upon those individuals? So that's within a country. To give you a really simple example, there's huge social value to be able to create COVID-19 tracing. And yet there's also immense power and damage that you could do to individuals with that information. So we need some things to actually manage that. For those of you that are interested, we have a little bit of writing on using data and also respecting users. So you could take a look at that on SSRN if you're interested. But the second tier is to then ask that question again, not within nation, but across nation states, because these things are incredibly powerful. China would like to have data in the United States on which teenagers are using TikTok and which might be receptive to the message that Taiwan is part of China. That's an interesting question. And that's something that we're all going to have to struggle with as you look at nation states contending with nation states. Vladimir Putin is trying to influence our elections. India has just banned a number of the Chinese apps inside China. So we have to look at that question both internally, the monopoly power of the state versus the citizen, or the platform versus the citizen, but then also what's in the interest of one country versus another, and what's the right answer in each of those cases. Those are going to be questions we're going to be wrestling with for a decade. And I promise you, those are things we're going to be visiting again, across different countries.
So, Marshall, I think that actually is a pretty great place to end. And the reason is that you just laid out a research agenda that will ensure that when we come and do this next year, much like this year, we'll have a whole new host of interesting things to say. So again, I would just like to thank the IDE team, thank all of the participants and panelists, and of course, all of the people who made time for us today in this online format. So
we're incredibly fortunate you all could join us. Thank you very much.
Great show, gentlemen. Thanks very much. For those of you who have a moment to perhaps fill out a survey for us under the poll button, you can tell us who you are and give us some comments. There are more than 900 of you today on this webcast, so a tremendous success and powerful reach. Carrie Reynolds really ran the show today, and I want to thank her. You can see her there. She's done a terrific job in putting the event together. Behind the scenes, Jovi Caney, Tammy Buzzle, and Joanne Batsiotegos got about 50 of you who are having technical problems onto the webcast. So thanks to them, our speakers, our co-chairs, obviously, Jeff, Marshall, and Peter, our co-host, Devin Cook, there as well. We will post videos for this event by the latest on Monday. So if there's anything you missed or wanted to reference, you can certainly check back in with us then. We couldn't have done any of this without our sponsors and donors. It's been great to have their support, and I know many of them were with us today. So I hope that everybody will be well, will be safe, and we'll build a platform. We'll see you soon enough. Enjoy the remainder of the summer. Cheers.
Great.
See you soon.
Thank you, David.
thank you.